we are going through the entire week 9 module of working as a clinical research coordinator, and well, narrated by myself. What an honor to cover Monica here. And let's see what we got on here, Chris. Let's see the slides. Okay, so ALCOA-C. By the way, I'm gonna drop in the comments a 30-minute video on ALCOA-C. There's actually more. There's 4 more acronyms since ALCOA-C. It's ALCOA-CCEA, and it's quite a lot of acronyms. ALCOA-CCEA. The last part, the last C, E, and A are relatively new, and it's not really standard practice. ALCOA-C is still what most people use, but I have a video I just dropped in the comments. If you want the full CCEA, just check it out. But it's basically attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete. So hopefully we know what these things mean. If not, we'll go through them right now. But again, if you want 30 minutes just on this, I just dropped in the comments it's actually 20 minutes, so it's not that long, 20-minute video on the full acronym ALCOA-CCEA. Pretty crazy stuff. By the time we retire from the industry, we'll probably have the whole alphabet here in a different random order. But attributable is when documenting data, whether it's on paper or on source. eSource does this. This is why I like eSource. eSource automatically does attributable, because no one's supposed to log in as anyone else, as we all know. So it's automatically attributed to you. And same thing with legible. eSource is great for that because everything's legible. Contemporaneous as well, because contemporaneous should bring time and date of when something was done. So these 3 things on this slide, attributable, legible, and contemporaneous. Essentially, attributable is, can it be traced back to the individual who's responsible for recording or collecting or generating the piece of data? So whether this is a signature, initials. This is why they also have signature and initials on the delegation log, so they can match it with who did it in the real study, especially if it's on a piece of paper as opposed to on an eSource. At my site, we use mostly eSource, but the PIs and sub-Is still sign wet ink the lab results and ECGs. So sometimes their signatures or initials are messy. So you can actually see, you compare the signature and initials to delegation log, and then you don't have to guess who it was, right? And so that's attributable. It's very important in research to have something attributable to you. Legible, I think it's self-explanatory. Contemporaneous is the date should be recorded, signed at the time in real time. This is again why I like Creo or any eSource, but Creo is the sponsor of my podcast, and so I use Creo at my site. It's done automatically. Now there are some data fields. You can program it to where you can enter on Creo the time and date, but when you save it, it's still gonna automatically e-sign the date that it was done contemporaneously. So you're always going to be contemporaneously compliant with Creo. Now you may get queries. The monitor might say, well, why does this blood pressure, why did you put in the field that you did it at 4:12 when Creo e-signed it at 4:15? And you can say, well, that's because we had multiple things on this page. There was maybe blood pressure, maybe there was weight. So by the time we hit save, it was later. But when we actually recorded it, we put those time periods there. So E-source is not the cure-all for everything. Like sometimes it does cause other problems, but it takes care of contemporaneousness at least. Next slide, Chris. Now we're gonna see the O, the A, and the C. So the O is original is this the first place the data was generated? So the classic example, if you weigh a patient for a vital signs and you bring a sticky note with you and you write down their weight on a sticky note, that sticky note, if it's the first place that weight was ever recorded, that is the source. That is the original source. Even if you are going to transcribe it somewhere later, maybe you like to have a cleaner source, or you like to have an e-source where you're going to upload it later. You got to upload it. That is the original. That is part of good documentation practices, that you keep the original. Why do we do that? It's to make sure that the data is accurate, which is the last A, but let's get to that is the next letter, so accurate. It's a perfect segue into accuracy because original leads to accuracy. If you try to remember what the original was, but not actually have the original, you have a chance for it to not be accurate. And so that's what the A is in ALCOA. It means accurate. And then the C stands for complete. So researchers need to make sure that their documentation is complete. Again, Creo, shout out to Creo, or any source for that matter, but I use Creo, it's the only one I know. It's automatically done for you. Headers, it doesn't let you go past a certain point without having it be complete. You can skip it, but it doesn't let you complete the visit until every single piece of data that's being requested by the source is complete. And by complete, you could put NA, but you have to put a value. And these are to be compliant with good documentation practices, which is ALCOA-C. Next slide, kind sir, Chris. Randomization visit, every site owner's favorite visit in the world. This is the visit where the sites get paid. Most screenings have screen fail ratios, so you don't actually get paid for all the work done at screenings necessarily. But when you randomize a patient, very good stuff happens for the site. And so this is like the big day for any study, because screening, it's nice, we could celebrate them, but randomization is really where the celebrations are deserved, because it means you actually have a patient successfully passed the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So this is important because you have to ensure that the participant does actually qualify for the study. And this usually requires multiple people to check. So this requires the coordinator, this requires the PI, this might require the sub-I, this might require sign-off from somebody from the sponsor or CRO. Increasingly common, especially for more complex studies, someone from the sponsor has to sign off on the randomization, especially for the more complex studies. I know, and we do a lot of psychiatry studies at my site lately, and increasingly so, you have to get the sponsor to sign off on this form in order for the patient to be allowed to be randomized. So that's essentially what they're doing, is they're trying to prevent deviations. It's a very bad deviation for a patient to randomize when they don't belong. And unlike things you might have heard in the past, not all protocol deviations are equal. Like randomizing a patient that doesn't belong in a study is one of the worst deviations you can have. I don't know if Chris wanted to add some color on this. I left off. The randomization visit is usually synonymous with baseline visit. So you might hear randomization, baseline, they're the same thing. Randomized essentially means what treatment arm of the study the subject is randomized to. Now, not all studies are randomized, but randomized trials, double-blind placebo-controlled and randomized is the gold standard of medical research, but not every study has randomization. There are observational studies where there is no randomization, but for the most part, like 90% of trials, I think, have randomization. And what treatment arm of the study the subject will be randomized to. And remember, double blind, the patient doesn't know what they're getting. The site doesn't know what they're getting. The sponsor does know because they have the unblinded codes. And if there is an emergency, the site can unbreak the blind. And so baseline or randomization typically occurs when the IP is started. And all future visits originate from baseline visit, which is usually day 0, day 1. It just depends on the protocol. But just think of randomization and baseline as basically the same thing, because they are. Yeah, next slide, please, Chris. And there's more on randomization. So the subject needs to be randomized within the visit window. All visits have a window. So if the subject is outside the window, technically it's a deviation. And those are, like I said, not all deviations are created equally. Out of window deviations are the least sinful, if you will, if you want to bring morality into it. But out of window deviations sometimes are unavoidable. And then every future visit stems from randomization visit. Now, sponsors rarely give waivers other than out of window visits, but like if there's anything else on the inclusion exclusion criteria that is not met, sponsors will rarely give a waiver. They want clean data. They don't want to have to explain to the FDA why one patient was allowed. I mean, it's just, to them it's actually a waste of money to have someone who doesn't qualify get randomized, because they designed the study that way for a reason. They don't just design the studies because that's how they want the studies to be designed. They design the studies after numerous meetings with the FDA and agreement on what the FDA would want to see as far as data is concerned. And I discussed the medical monitor already. Sometimes the medical monitor has to approve, or someone from the sponsor has to approve. Next slide, please. Or anything else you wanted to add there, Chris? Interim monitoring visit. This is where, as a coordinator, you'll have a bunch of IMVs. I went to my site today for the first time all year, actually. And it's technically the second. The first was didn't count though. I just brought my son for everyone to see him. But it was the first time I went for as a real site director. One of my coordinators was complaining about their CRA, and they have all these queries, and you're gonna deal with interim monitoring visits constantly. So these are every 4 to 6 weeks, where the monitor will come. Sometimes it's every 8 weeks. It just depends on the monitoring plan. It also depends on how much you are enrolling, or how little you're enrolling, or how close you are to a database lock. There's a lot of variables, but basically you'll have regular monitoring visits in person. Some will be remote, but the in-person ones tend to do a better job in not just my opinion, I think in everyone's opinion. Once you've randomized your first patient, the CRA will need to be on site generally within 2 weeks of that randomization. And the site CRA will request a visit date to meet with the PI and the CRC. Once a date has been selected, they'll send a confirmation letter, and then you file this in the investigator site file, and then they will actually come to the site, and we go to the next slide, where they'll actually show up, and this is what they do. So a typical interim monitoring visit is a day. Sometimes it's longer if there's a lot of data. At our site, when we are relatively high enrollers, they usually stay 1 or 2 days. There's been times where they stay 3, but I mean, I've heard some stay for a week. But it just depends on your enrollment. It depends on how much of the data they have backed up, they being the monitors that they have to look at. The CRA will need to meet with the PI at every IMV, or at least speak to the PI over the phone. This is very important. Needless to say, they need to interact with the coordinator somehow as well. At my site, especially when we are busier, we'll have a CRA there, and then the coordinator will go do their own visits and be in a different room, sometimes even in a different building. But the CRA can always reach out to that coordinator and get an answer, or somebody from the site should at least. So generally the monitors will be by themselves, and they'll request things from you kind of as they go, and then at the end of the visit they'll have action items for you. And if something's urgent, they're going to definitely get a hold of you in a timely manner. Next slide, Chris. These are great. You're doing great. Preparing. Yeah. Now, how do you prepare as a coordinator for an IMV? Well, one of my favorite rappers, Sugar Free, said, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. So you don't actually have to prepare for one if you're ready. If you've been doing all your job as a coordinator, you actually don't have to prepare because there's nothing to prepare. But if you're behind, meaning labs haven't been signed by the PIs, clinical significance for labs or other values haven't been assessed, data has not been entered, queries from the last visit haven't been answered, action items from the last monitoring visit haven't been answered, then you better prepare, because the monitor is not going to want to have existing action items and a laundry list of like those action items add up. They don't go away just because you don't do them and just because another monitoring visit occurred. As a matter of fact, I used to be a monitor. When you come to the site and you repeatedly have the same action item open for like numerous monitoring visits, it actually gets escalated to the sponsor. And you don't necessarily want that, because they might close your site for screening, or they might pause you. They might put you on a screening hold until you get caught up. It's generally not good. So you want to be prepared. You want to have the action items done. But again, if you're doing your job as a coordinator, you don't actually have to prepare for a monitoring visit. And we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I mean, even my own coordinators, like, even when, like right now, we're not that busy. Unfortunately, we don't have any very easy studies. We're about to get some easier ones here soon, but like even they are not prepared. Like there's still action items that are not complete from last time, and if it gets too overdue, the monitor gets the site director involved, and that's obviously not good, because then it's my job as the site director to get my coordinator to do it. And you know, if they can't do it, that means we need to move on and figure out a way to figure out somebody who can do it. And nobody wants that. Like if you've been hired to be a coordinator, you're obviously capable, at least management thinks you're capable to do your job. So for the most part, they don't go on too long, but yes, there's always something pending, something missing from my experiences. So now we're on SAEs, which are serious adverse events. Just like deviations, not all adverse events are created equally. Serious adverse events require their own specific paperwork, basically their own documentation, forms. Every sponsor has slightly different SAE process, but all of them involve notifying the IRB within 24 hours, notifying the sponsor within 24 hours, and there's specific forms for these events. So any SAE is a serious adverse event is defined as an untoward occurrence that results in death, is life-threatening, hospitalization, disability or permanent damage, a birth defect, or something that requires intervention to prevent permanent impairment or damage. So it's obviously, just like the name entails, serious, because a non-serious adverse event would be a headache. A serious adverse event would be a headache that got so bad the person fainted and they ended up in the hospital, actually getting hospitalized. Not a trip to the ER, but actual hospitalization. That's a SAE, because anyone can go make a trip to the ER. I used to know somebody who was hypochondriac. They went to the ER for everything. Like they had a sneeze or a cough, they went to the ER. Well, if that person was in a study and they didn't specify hospitalization and not just a trip to the ER, that person would show a bunch of SAEs on their study file, which are unwarranted. So it's hospitalization generally, and you got to try to get the records. So there's an initial SAE report you got to do within 24 hours of learning of the incident, and then once you get a resolution to the SAE, you got to do a follow-up SAE report. And if there's a lot of time in between that, which is subjective, but the sponsor will definitely let you know, you might have to do follow-up SAE reports in between the initial and the final. Next slide, young Sauber. Booster visits. When you're not enrolling, somebody, usually a CRA, will come to your site and specifically figure out what's going on. Now, in fairness to this slide, we haven't had a booster visit in a long time that I can remember. It's now 2025, and that's not because we are great at enrolling in every study. We have had a few studies here in Yuma where we haven't randomized anyone, or even not screened, but we have had studies where we haven't randomized anyone, and we have had studies where it's been very slow screenings. But if your site is a outlier, meaning let's say the study's hard, there's a difficult study, but other sites are still enrolling or screening, let's say one patient a month, and your site has gone 6 months without screening, you're going to get a booster visit. You're at least going to get a call, and these days the booster visits might be virtual, but they're going to figure out what are some successful methods other sites might be using. Maybe you need help figuring out how the recruitment vendors work. Shout out to Patient Ace, which helps with that stuff. Chris and I are co-founders. But that's a booster visit, and there's not a need to spend that much time on booster visits, but just know what they are. Next slide, closeout visits. These are always fun. So they are closing out the IRB. This is at the end of the study when all data has been entered. There's no more active patients. All patients have completed one way or another. All queries have been answered. Database maybe has been locked. This is where the PI is going to sign off on the EDC, where the IRB is going to be notified that the site is closed out and that there's end dates on the delegation log. There's still the part about document storage. So another reason why I love Creo or eSource, you don't need to worry about storing documents, you just need to worry about having access to them, and Creo holds everything in the cloud for you. But they do put nicely closed out studies in a different folder on Creo, so they don't distract you from your existing studies. They're just kind of in the background, but you know that they are there. All the data you have is stored. Sponsors, so you need to store the source, the investigator site file, and even the EDC documents. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do we store the EDC documents? Well, they will usually send you a USB drive, or sometimes it's just a zip file that you download. And then what we do, because we have Creo, we upload it to Creo. So you don't really need to store anything if you're using the right tools. As far as the regulatory documents, because we use Creo, we upload them to Creo, and then we shred the originals, and then they're digitally certified. And it saves a lot of space, because those are huge binders. So if you look at the protocol, for example, it's 200 pages. Well, if you're just storing that in Creo, you don't actually have a huge binder at your site. which is, it's actually, if you're doing a lot of studies, it's an underrated perk because you don't need more like actual physical space. You don't need more real estate. A lot of people don't talk about this benefit really enough. Like remember when we had paper, Chris? Like we would have to rent more space than we thought we needed just because of binders and like storing stuff. Yeah. Yep. Correct. And there's a lot of options now. I mean, I know my podcast is sponsored by Creo and I recommend them, but there's a lot of vendors out there, but be careful about price because not all vendors are created equally. Like many times you do get what you pay for. So to continue on the closeout visit, like I said, the PI has to sign end dates on the delegation logs, the ConMed logs. A lot of people don't realize these have PI required to either leave the ConMeds as ongoing for the medications and then sign and date it, or that they had an end date. Same thing with the adverse events. Adverse events could still be ongoing when the study closed, or they could have resolved themselves. And so the monitor, the coordinator work together to figure out every last detail of this. Delegation log signed off. I have an interesting story about this. Master IP log signed off at study closeout. Individual subject IP logs signed off. Make sure all the IPs reconciled. A lot of CRAs wait till the last minute to do this and gives the CRCs a lot of work at closeout visit, but if you are reconciling them as a coordinator, you're gonna be okay. And then protocol deviation log signed off. So my story is, I had a study, and Chris knows this one. This has happened recently. I had a study, the first study we did here in Yuma, we only screened 4 people and they all screen failed. Also at closeout, the investigational product as well as the lab kits, they will either have to be destroyed on site or sent back to the sponsor. Now typically, and everyone's SOP is different, but our SOP says we ship back IP unless sponsor requests that we destroy it. Most of the time sponsor will accept it back, and we will destroy our lab kits. And then the CRA will have a master return log where they track the return of the drug if they're being shipped back, and if they're going to be destroyed, you have to have some kind of documentation that they're destroyed. And then you got to make sure everything's up to date at the closeout. So they look at where the CV signed every 2 years. Was the GCP always kept up? If not, there's going to be a note to file. Were the protocol trainings ever expired? Was the IRB approval or continuation ever expired? If there's any gaps or any irregularities from a regulatory standpoint, you'll need note to file to explain why. For the most part, if the monitor and the coordinator are doing their job, there's not a gap in anything. But for example, let's say that your CLIA waiver expired for like a month. I mean, it's pretty bad, but you're going to need a note to file, because if you catch it a year later, what are you going to do? Like, there's nothing you can do, but you have to write a note to file should you ever be audited. Why it happened, maybe a CAPA plan, corrective action, preventative action. You got to tie up all loose ends. And that's another thing you'll have to do at a closeout visit. Next slide, or is this the last one? Well, we appreciate you guys for listening to this week 9 module of the CRC Academy.